This is an engine that right from the moment I laid eyes on it, I knew it had to feature on its own. Sat among the big boys of Lodestar, the K2 and the Duchess, sits an unassuming little engine. It's so small that many people miss it. This is Pet, and she's one of my personal favourites. Crewe Works was, and still is, one of the cornerstones of the railway. At its peak, the works could push out at least one locomotive a week and is responsible for many famous engines such as the Princess classes, the Black Fives and the Jubilee classes. It was the home base of Sir William Stanier and the heart of the London and North Western Railway. But there is a railway very dear to Crewe's heart. In fact, for many years, Crewe's works simply couldn't run without it. It was the railway within the railway, the Crewe Works Railway. The Crewe Works Railway was a narrow-gauge internal railway designed for moving larger parts and goods from one end of the works to the other. In the days where forklift trucks were yet to be seen and horses were impractical, the little railway was a perfect solution rather than using pulleys and ropes. The 18-inch gauge railway was the invention of the London and North Western Railway's superintendent John Ramsbottom. He was a Yorkshireman and was the son of a cotton mill owner. His father's cotton mill used steam engines to power the machines, and so John, by the maintenance and repair of these machines, learnt a lot about them. He eventually rebuilt the steam engines and the looms to run more efficiently. His attention turned from steam looms to steam engines and applied what he had learned to improving the railways. In 1839, after joining the Sharp, Robert and Company in Manchester, John took his knowledge of steam engines to a new level and was recommended to become the superintendent for the then Manchester and Birmingham Railway. After its merger to become the London and North Western Railway, John held on to his position and was responsible for all lines north of Rugby, which held its central base at Crewe. Now, with these works under his jurisdiction, John thought it prudent to bring the works up to date with cutting-edge technology and new design. In 1857, John designed a new type of narrow-gauge railway exclusive to hauling locomotive parts around the works. The 18-inch gauge railway was a first, and the engine that ran on it was nothing anyone had ever seen before. These new type of steam engines were so small and narrow they could easily fit around the confines of the factory with little fuss. Several engines were built for this railway, and these 040 engines spent most of their lives moving anything from pistons to boilers. The engines themselves were pretty simple, consisting mostly of a boiler and a firebox, with room for a single driver, and would be the equivalent of the forklift truck of today. After the success of Crewe's railway, other factories took notice and began to adopt their own railways within their factory walls. But John wasn't finished with his little project. As the factory grew, so did the railway, and the railway was split into 4 parts. The original section, located in then known as the Old Works, was in the oldest part of the factory and stretched for 850 yards, snaking around bits of old parts and workmen. The next part was located in the steel works. This was the largest section and the heaviest working. The steel would be manufactured on site, and the railway was responsible for the supply of the steel to all parts of the works. The third section was situated within the joinery department. These did not use steam-hauled engines. Instead, the railway was built on 3 levels and was a handheld propelled tramway. The railway became the longest part of the railway in use, only closing in 1980. The final extension to the railway was a through line direct to Crewe station itself. The construction of the railway cumulated with the construction of the famous Spider Bridge. The bridge had a dual purpose of ferrying passengers from the station to the factory, and the railway ran down the centre of the bridge. The Spider Bridge was aptly named due to the way it was built and was supported mostly by stilts and suspension cables. The railway was used to ferry goods from the station to practically the factory door. The 5 engines created for the railway worked without fuss and were given the names of Tiny, Pet, Nipper, Topsy and Midge by the crews that looked after them. In 1876, Billy and Dicky joined the fleet. Billy and Dicky were very different engines to the others. They were designed by Francis Webb, who was John Ramsbottom's assistant in the 1860s and worked with him for 6 years before Webb resigned his post to pursue a managerial job in the nearby Bolton Iron and Steel Company. In 1870, John Ramsbottom had given notice he was to leave his post as superintendent, leaving John's intended successor, Thomas Spuds, to fill the post. Sadly, Thomas passed away before formally taking up the position, so the chairman of the LNWR contacted Webb and offered him the job. Webb agreed and took up position in 1871. Webb was in his role for 30 years, where his position changed to Chief Mechanical Engineer and oversaw the construction of many famous locomotives such as the Jumbo class and the G1 class, but Webb was forced to retire early due to ill health. In 1930, in an attempt to modernise the now ageing tramway, a final engine was added to the fleet. Built by world-renowned Hudswell Clark, this 18-inch gauge engine was a first for diesel locomotive for the London, Midland and Scottish Railway. It was named Crewe D563. The engine was powered by a 20 horsepower 3-cylinder engine and proved itself to be a powerful little thing. Things, though, were changing within the factory. Rails were soon being replaced by wheels, and the internal combustion engine was encroaching on the railway's territory. In 1932, just 2 years after Crewe was brought to the railway, Crewe Works decided that the little railway was simply not effective enough to compete with the new modern vehicles, and it was decided it would be decommissioned. Dicky, Midge, Topsy and Nipper all fell to the cutter's torch in 1931, with Tiny being scrapped 2 years prior, leaving Billy, Pet and Crewe. For Pet, it somehow managed to survive the torch, despite it being one of the first to be withdrawn, and it lay left forgotten in a shed in the works. For Billy and Crewe, the trail goes a little bit cold. It is said that Billy was sold to a place called Cashmore's in the West Midlands, after which not much is known, but it is likely Billy was eventually scrapped. As for Crewe, it was transferred to the Lancashire and Yorkshire Works at Horwich in 1934, but then the engine seemed to disappear. The only evidence what might have happened to this engine is a photograph which had a handwritten note stating "Withdrawn 10:57. If this is true, then it is safe to assume that this little engine headed for the scrapyard in the early 60s. Pet, though, remained safe and sound at the back of the shed, alone and forgotten. Apart from the hand-drawn railway in the joinery section, the railway was long since torn up and the engine's work was taken over by smaller forklifts. It was rediscovered in 1965 by sheer chance. Realising that Pet was likely the very last remnant of the old railway, the engine was taken to the Narrowgauge Railway Museum in Towan. It was carefully restored to pristine condition and taken to its final home, the National Collection. Pet now lives in the Great Hall with the likes of Evening Star and Mallard. It is one of the smallest engines in the museum and can easily be missed by visitors. But if you look around the turntable, you might spot Pet sitting proudly, surrounded by the very engines it would have undoubtedly helped build.